Welcome to The Economy Magazine. I'm Natalie Ehrlich here with the day's global economic highlights. Well, coming up, the World Economic Forum is out with its annual Global Gender Gap Index, revealing Israel ranks 65 out of 142 developed nations. In South Africa, the public hearings over the Marikana massacre come to a close, but the question of responsibility remains open. Well, first, let's look at today's headlines. Shares fell in Europe and Asia on Wednesday, while the dollar rose across the board, hitting a new 7-year high against the yen, as investors now focus on diverging outlooks for the world's major economies. Well, oil prices stayed near 4-year lows on signs of possible disagreements between OPEC members ahead of a meeting next week. European shares opened lower, weighed down by miners after a sharp drop in iron ore prices. Now, the pan-European FTSE Euro First 300 index was down 0.3%. Well, investors are now turning their attention again to Japan. Tokyo stocks fell as investors took profits on gains made on Tuesday when the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe delayed a sales tax, calling for a snap election instead. Abe said that he is postponing the second stage of a sales tax hike, which would see it rise to 10% within 18 months. Abe now hopes that his delay can now help the economy out of a slump caused by the April tax hike, as locals are squeezed by rising living costs and also falling incomes. The Prime Minister is calling a snap election to gauge the public's view on the tax, which was meant to secure funds to finance rising Social Security costs for its aging population.
We have finally grasped this chance of breaking free from deflation, which has plagued us for the past 15 years. We cannot let go of this chance. We must not return to the dark and confused period.
Well, Ukraine is trying to avoid having to rely on an interim gas deal signed last month, instead eventually ending its reliance on Russian gas by cultivating better relations with the EU. Naftogaz chief executive Andrei Kobolyev told Reuters on Tuesday Ukraine had significant stores of gas but did not specify quantities. Now, according to EU data, Ukraine's reserves are roughly half full. Well, the CEO also said that the interim gas deal with their Russian neighbors was only an insurance policy.
Had there been full interconnection between Ukrainian gas transmission system and European gas transmission system, namely in Slovakia, because that is a major route, we would not need Russian gas at all.
Groups of protesters held rallies around Indonesia on Wednesday against a hike on subsidized fuel prices. Two groups of protesters stood in front of the presidential palace in the capital, Jakarta. Demonstrators were waving flags, placards, and singing songs, and about 100 labor group members urged the government to lower fuel prices.
The protest is to show our rejection of President Joko Widodo's policy, which pulls out the fuel subsidies and increases the fuel price. Our rejection is based on our knowledge that energy is the basic right of people, which must be fulfilled by the country to reduce subsidies.
In other news, Israeli women need to work 3 months more than men to get an equal paycheck for equal work. And that gender gap is a reality all around the world. Now, Karen Kirsch, as well as Anthony Lesmy, connect us with a group fighting for equal pay in the private sector as well as beyond.
An Israeli woman needs to work additional 3 months to reach the annual compensation of a man in the same job. And Israel is not alone. In all Western countries, the wage gap is similar, between 17 to 30%, all across the board, regardless of education, in both public and private sectors. The World Economic Forum publishes an annual gender gap index among 142 developed countries. In 2014, Israel ranked at poor 65, down from last year's 53 position. A number of Israeli social change organizations came together to try and close the gap in a new project funded by the European Union.
Everybody is surprised to understand, to see that they have wage gaps. Everybody thinks of themselves as the benevolent employer, and everyone that we've dealt with, at least, finds wage gaps.
The program attempts to both map and gather data regarding wage gaps, as well as offer tools to deal with it. It is the first program to direct efforts at engaging the private sector.
Of course, there's the men who are often suspicious of what will happen to their salaries. What we're trying to say to employers, it eventually it will come as a duty. Eventually it will be in the legislation. We see that happening in Canada. We see that happening in Australia. We're working on it together here in Israel.
Israeli laws forbid gender discrimination. Stronger enforcing sanctions are required. This summer, Israeli parliament passed 2 amendments to its laws. The first requires public companies to disclose wages according to gender. The second strengthens sanctions regarding discrimination.
By Israeli law, you can only sue the differences of pay, which means that if you earn 10,000 shekels and the man earned 15,000 shekels, you can only sue for 5,000 shekels for each month you worked. What we tried to do, and we succeeded, was to give the possibility to sue for compensation for the mere fact that you were discriminated because you're a woman.
Private sector wage gaps may be explained by market forces, but the public sector should lead the way in creating an equal work environment. Limor Livnat, Minister of Culture and Sports, also heads the government's Women's Promotion Committee. In the conference, she called women to ask, check and compare their compensation, and detailed new efforts made by the government to rectify the situation by adopting recommendations of a special civil service commission examination into women's promotion in the public sector.
In 5 years, half of the executive management, the highest management positions in the public sector, will be held by women. The ministers and office executive directors are personally obligated to execute this decision, and the Civil Service Commission is following it up. Offices who will not comply will not be allowed to hire new employees.
The committee also recommended to put ministers' executive directors directly in charge of equal, transparent compensation distribution. So Israel minds the gap, but will it close in 5 years? That remains to be seen.
And joining us now for a discussion on the World Economic Forum's annual Global Gender Gap Index, we're joined with an insider perspective from our very own Karen Kirsch. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. What can you tell us about this project?
Well, first of all, full disclosure, before I worked here, I used to work in that project. So I kind of know it personally. It's a joint 3-year cooperation of 4 organizations, Shatil, the Advar Research Center, the Israel Women's Network, where I used to work, and the Equal Opportunity Commission, which is at the Economy Ministry. And this project is trying to push forward this promotion of women, as has been done all over the world for, the past few decades. Because this data, as we've said, is really not just an Israeli one.
Right, this is far from a local matter.
Oh yes, it's far from local matter, and it's actually coming up more and more in recent weeks, probably because of this World Forum new information that came out a couple of weeks ago. Kathy Russell, which is the U.S. ambassador at large for women's global issues, has spoken yesterday at a conference in London, and she tried to actually make a point about how women's equality is important for other factors as well. Let's hear a bit of what she has to say.
At that rate, we'll have to wait 81 years for gender parity in the workplace. I don't imagine any of us will be here to celebrate at that point, but maybe some of us are very young. I'm not keen on waiting until 2095 to see women take their rightful place in the global economy. And women, their families, and their countries really can't afford to wait that long either.
So 81 years, that's a long time for us to wait. Maybe our granddaughters will enjoy this. And meanwhile, what we can do is perhaps help promote awareness, which is part of what I'm doing here. But there are some more funnier women than me who try to join in the effort. Sarah Silverman is actually launched last month, a campaign in the US that attempts to raise the $30 trillion that society owes women due to the gender gap. Let's see a bit of it.
Every year, the average woman loses around $11,000 to the wage gap. Over the course of the working years of her life, that's almost 500 grand. That's a $500,000 vagina tax.
Indeed, Sarah Silverman is very vocal on many issues, and it's great to see her on this one as well. What else can be done to minimize the setbacks?
Well, one of the greatest, challenges in this sort of situation and effort is to turn what is accepted as explanations for the gap into excuses. And to say, well, it's true that women work less hours. but they are more productive during these hours, so maybe we should change that. Because it's a complicated social issue to think of, reasons and explanations and excuses can all be the same thing, I guess.
Well, thank you so much for your insight. It's wonderful to get your inside perspective on this project.
Thank you.
Well, now, it has been 2 years since 34 miners were shot and killed by police while striking at the Marikana mine in South Africa. Now, has justice been done? Let's take a look.
White crosses stand where 34 miners were shot and killed by South African police on August 16, 2012. 76 others were injured in the clashes in the town of Marikana. They'd been taking part in a long strike at the Lonmin platinum mine. In the few days before, 10 people had already died, including 2 policemen killed with machetes. But more than 2 years later, the circumstances of the massacre remain muddled.
Within 2 years' time, we still think the truth is not yet to come out, because there isn't even one cop being to jail up to now. And then we have been to jail. I was in jail, and there are many of us who died on the spot, but they didn't get any justice. We don't have any justice up to now.
Amid public fury at the time, President Jacob Zuma set up an inquiry. The Marikana Commission was scheduled to run for only 4 months, but has been sitting for 2 years. More than 50 witnesses have been heard, with reconstructions of the events. It's emerged that the police attempted a cover-up after the massacre, but the question of responsibility remains open. Lawyers representing the victims' families accuse South Africa's Deputy President, Cyril Ramaphosa, who was a director of Lonmin at the time, of having lobbied ministers to crack down on the striking miners. They want senior police commanders to be charged with murder and Lonmin executives to be charged as accomplices.
The fact that 76 people were seriously injured proves, I think, beyond doubt, that the police were on a shooting spree.
No one has faced any punishment over the massacre, which reawakened painful memories of apartheid-era police killings. The final report on the shooting is not due until the end of March 2015.
And now we're joined by our very own Daniel Roth for a look at musical philanthropy. Well, thank you for joining us today. What update do you have on this Band-Aid single?
Yeah, so Band-Aid, 30 years ago, Band-Aid got together. This was a super group of British stars specifically raising money for famine in Ethiopia and Africa. This is 30 years later, and Bob Geldof, who was kind of the linchpin of this, tried to get it together again this year in order to fight Ebola. And there's kind of been a little bit of controversy surrounding this, a little bit of mistreatment maybe. Of course, in the US, they had We Are the World, and in Canada, they had Tears Are Not Enough, these super groups of stars who come together and kind of give their time. But we've had a lot of articles in Slate and The Guardian talking about, is this really appropriate? Are these lyrics really appropriate? What kind of message are they sending the world about Africa? They're kind of...
But they're doing something for the public good, so why is this controversial?
Well, so the image they give of Africa is, first of all, that Africa is a monolith. Second of all, that it is a monolithic, violent continent where it's just death and destruction all the time. And so that's the first piece of the puzzle. The second piece of the puzzle is pointed out in this Telegraph piece. Adele was asked to join this. Adele, who's very famous now, very respected singer, was asked to join this Band-Aid 30 project, and she just didn't answer. She's raising a family. She just didn't get back to Geldof, who called her out in public about this. And actually, it turned out that she had given a private donation to Oxfam. She had already given an enormous amount of money, we can assume. It was private. And she essentially said without saying, look, I'm going to give money, not time. All of these other celebrities are giving time and not money, even though a vast majority of us are rich. I'm going to put in my money and keep my mouth shut, especially because these messages, again, from The Guardian, Slate, from these op-eds coming around, the message is perhaps questionable. Let me just throw some money down. And Geldof really called her out and said, that's not good enough. I decide what's going to be the message and how it's going to be. This is a guy, by the way, who in this Telegraph article, it's pointed out, he's maybe worth 32 million pounds. And when asked about how much taxes he pays, he said, I give my time. I don't need to give, isn't that tax enough?
Well, I did read that article as well. What stood out to you in terms of why is this so controversial versus time versus money? What's the difference?
Look, I think that both are important. You can't have real change without both time and money put in. Of course, at the end of the day, artists' time needs to be a part of the puzzle, but you need an enormous amount of money. You also need global policies to shift. All of these are part of the puzzle, and the problem here is that people are really pulling it apart.
Well, thank you so much for your insight. It's certainly an issue that we will continue to look at as we watch the African continent. Well, that does wrap up our economic coverage today. Join us tomorrow, same time, same place. Thank you again for watching.